Yeah, as if you hadn't seen this curve enough over the last month, thought I'd throw it up on the screen again because it's something that you see appear through a lot of the innovation theory, and I think it's actually really helpful to understand what's going on as things change over time. So I'm going to present three different frameworks or lenses, if you like, to think about this through, and we'll share some examples of how this comes out, to how this applies. So one of the big dimensions here obviously is time. So time marches on and things change over time. And so when we look at a curve like this, so this is the famous diffusion of innovation curve, which was made famous by Everett Rogers in the 60s. And you can see here on this curve, which I imagine a lot of people are familiar with, on the far left down here, when something first comes out or is invented, there's a very small proportion of people who take it up, and then that progresses to the early adopters, the early majority, late majority, and the laggards. And you can see, it's a bell curve, so a lot of people wait until it feels safe, those early majority type folks. And then there's the minority who, really hold out. And then that the yellow line there is showing the market share. So eventually any innovation gets to a point where the market is saturated. So you could say, and I'll speak a bit more about the smartphone example in a moment, but you could say the market's basically saturated now. Who do you know that doesn't have a smartphone? So, that's an example of, it's sort of at this 100% saturation. So innovation becomes, it's a different challenge now when you're trying to innovate in a saturated market. So, to pull into focus some other technologies that we're familiar with, you could say likewise the websites is something that everyone has. You're surprised if someone doesn't have a website these days, whereas something like cloud, probably the early majority are on board. I wouldn't say that we still come across a lot of companies who haven't moved to the cloud. AI emerging, AR, I would say is augmented reality is still something that it's only really the innovators or very early adopters that are playing with that or bringing that into their business. So that's how you might think about some innovations or some particular technologies in this context. Just briefly mentioned Everett Rogers, who made this diffusion of innovation theory famous in the 60s. He talks about four components or conditions, if you like, that drive the diffusion of innovation. And they are the innovation itself, whatever it is, and communication, time, as time progresses, and also the social system surrounding it. So one example I really like is around the shipping container industry, which is an incredible innovation that's really changed the world as we know it. But it's the kind of thing that, like, well, how did they used to do it? They used to have ships, and they'd put things, from what I understand, essentially in nets or bags, and they would pack it into the hull and on the ship, and it would go over to the port, and it would get unloaded. And then someone had this idea, well, if we get everything into a standardized, rectangular box, and we design the ships to accommodate that, then that's going to be far more efficient. But what it really required was the whole system change. So you needed the trucks that could take the shipping containers. You needed the equipment at the ports that could lift up the containers off the ships. And it wasn't until all of those pieces came into play that the innovation was really unlocked. So that's an example, I think, of a more complex one, where you need a bunch of pieces to fall into place. I was just on a call before with Sundar, and we were talking about someone we work with in the energy field, and they're waiting for batteries to come into probably the early majority part of this curve before their innovation can then tap into that system and be unlocked. So, when corporates are looking to innovate, they're not working in isolation. They're working as part of a bigger system, and they've got to make bets on, when do they think certain things are going to fall. And not only is it a system, it's a competitive system. So there's other people also playing bets, and who's going to get there at the right time is the question. That's the game that everyone's playing in this sense. So this is another sort of way of looking at things, and this is the work of a guy called Simon Wardley, who's really very interesting and got a lot of great ideas in the space of innovation. And he looks at these stages of evolution, which go from genesis through to custom, through to product or rental services, and through to a commodity. But he isn't as attached to the idea of time. He thinks that what drives an innovation or something to go through these stages of evolution, you can't really say, well, it's always going to take 2 years or 5 years or whatever. It really depends. And I think something we're observing more broadly is that things are speeding up because of a lot of other supporting innovations and technologies. But either way, Simon Wardley doesn't think about it in the context of time, but he still sees these stages of evolution. So we'll talk more about what each of these mean in a moment, but hopefully the words make sense there, that something comes out brand new, it's in genesis, is very unknown, and then eventually as it starts to get adopted, it was more in a custom form, and then it eventually becomes a more repeatable type product, and then eventually a commodity or utility service. And here you can see those ideas plotted out on that similar familiar S-curve. But notice that the axes aren't time, it's around demand and supply. So, but you can still see how that, still matches that same idea that something starts out, then over time increases in popularity and scale, and eventually everyone's using it once it becomes a commodity. This looks quite overwhelming at first glance. I don't want you to take it all in, but what you can see across the top here is, these 4 stages we just talked about, and these are the characteristics of each of these stages, and some really interesting ideas in here. I'm going to ask us just to focus on these bottom few rows, and it's around like that first one there is failure in the context of these stages of evolution. And you can see here in the genesis, failure is basically expected. If you're, the mad scientist in your workshop, you're going to be expecting, 1 in 100, 1 in 1,000 of your things to work. That's the name of the game. But as we progress along, the appetite for failure decreases. So once you're in a sort of custom type world, it's, you still know that things might not be perfect all the time, but your expectation is that things are going to work. Once you get through to a product or a commodity, you're really expecting it to be very stable at that point, and failure is basically not tolerated. So we go from genesis, where you've got a high tolerance for failure, through custom, product, or a commodity. You can see how the tolerance for failure decreases. Now, to introduce one third and final way of looking at it, which I think starts to bring it into focus for us in terms of the work that we do in corporate innovation. Sorry, I was going to talk about these technologies along that, but you get that picture. This is what I was wanting to get to. This is from Barry O'Reilly, who we actually had come in and do a talk for us at DS a while ago. He's got a book called The Lean Enterprise. And this is the idea of having an innovation portfolio. And again, you can see this familiar kind of trajectory. And the idea here is that any organization, any corporate should have a portfolio of products or activities or technologies that are spread across this this life cycle here. So you should have some things in your explore bucket, But then as they get into, exploit, once you're actually harvesting value from those and looking to grow them, then they get into a sustained phase where you're looking to make it quite efficient, and it's more like a commodity at that point. And then eventually you've got to accept that it's going to be disrupted. Something else is going to come in, and you've got to have the discipline to retire some of your activities or technologies. So this is this idea of a innovation portfolio, and it's really, for a corporate, this sustain type phase is very important, because that's where the cash cows are. And probably the one real point that I'd like to get across with the couple of minutes remaining is, what does an organization optimize for? Startups, we know, are very optimized for the explore phase, and they're looking to see the curve start to go up from getting product market fit, where you can prove that there's something that can be exploited here to create value. But what we see in corporates is that they're optimized for this stage of the game, around sustaining an innovation in market. And that's where you're looking to reduce costs and reduce variability. And so when we come into contact, or when innovators come into contact with people in organizations that are thinking about sustaining something and optimizing it along those lines, we get some friction, because they're incentivized differently, they think differently. So we do a lot of work around this area here of helping customers take something where they've got the idea, take it out of the explore phase and bring it in to the exploit phase, so that they can then eventually have it move across as to something that they can continue to sustain and get value from. DS as an organization isn't optimized to help organizations in this phase of the game. Typically, it's more around, how can we help them get a product to market, rather how do we help them offshore and drive costs down, as an example.